trying to paint a positive picture when that's not consistent with the realities that businesses and households on the ground feel is not very conducive to building confidence. And that's really the key here, how to rebuild household and business confidence. And it's going to take, at this stage, a combination of measures. I think there is going to have to be some front-loaded macroeconomic stimulus, especially fiscal stimulus, possibly in the form of direct fiscal support to households that could help in terms of their consumption. But we're also going to need some measures from the government that show that there is a longer-term policy agenda at work, especially in terms of supporting private enterprises, because the reality is that unless the private sector steps up to the plate, it's going to be very difficult for China to achieve both its short-term and long-term objectives. And right now, the government seems to be trying to deal with some of the symptoms of these problems that are showing up in the stock market in terms of capital outflows and so on. But it needs a much clearer policy agenda at this stage.
So, Eswar, it sounds like you're saying, they need a clear policy agenda here. But given that we've seen months and months where there's been lots and lots of these incremental measures to try and support local government debt or the property sector, are we actually going to see that coming through this year and potentially in March during the two sessions?
I hope so, Len. But so far, you're right, the omens are not very promising. Now, I should point out that at the end of December 2023, President Xi Jinping did give a speech where he acknowledged some of the difficult realities that enterprises and households were facing and indicated that the government would take resolute measures to set the economy back on track. We haven't seen those resolute measures, and what we've seen is a lot of spin in terms of positivity, in terms of whatever data we see out there, and that's not quite going to cut it. Now, China does have a playbook it can turn to. In the past, it has used these frameworks. If you think about the internationalization of the renminbi, whatever the ultimate objective might have been, the reality is that plan included a number of measures, including financial market development, better regulatory approaches, and so on, that were very good for China in any case. So I think they need to come up with a broader framework like that, rather than relying on piecemeal actions, which I think are going to be inadequate at this stage.
I'm also wondering, Eswar, you were talking about Xi Jinping's speech there, and then, a few weeks later, we obviously had that Davos speech by Li Qiang, where he seemed, quite pleased in terms of that 5.2% GDP. Just in terms of, I guess, a contrary argument to that, could it just be that the Chinese government, they know they're going through a longer-term structural change in terms of China's economy, and it's simply that they are lowering their expectations going forward?
That's a good point, Lynn. Certainly the government, for a couple of years, tried to even get away from growth targets. They have returned to growth targets right now, and those are certainly more modest than in previous years. But the reality is that China faces a lot of difficulties right now. It's not just the property market unraveling, the stock market having a difficult time, but longer-term structural factors, including weakening demographics, the huge burden of debt, including local government financing vehicles, debt that is out there. So to deal with all of those, what they're really going to need is better productivity growth. And for that, you certainly need some structural reforms, because ultimately, both in terms of productivity growth and employment growth, you need the private sector to pull its weight. And unfortunately, right now, we're not seeing private investment doing very well because the private sector doesn't seem to have a clear sense of the government's policy agenda, and in fact seems to be concerned about signals that the government is going to be somewhat hostile towards the private sector. Likewise, I think households are floundering a little bit right now without a sense of a clear direction of policies and added uncertainty. So there is a pretty heavy policy lift ahead of the Chinese government.
Eswar, is it conceivable that we could see a one-off sharp devaluation of the Chinese currency in order to lift exports and help the economy that way?
That, I think, is unlikely, Sri. We saw in 2015 when the Chinese government did try to move forward with even a modest devaluation, although that was in the context of a broader reform of the exchange rate system, that did not work very well. At this stage, given that there is a real problem with confidence, both in terms of domestic households and businesses, but also foreign investors, I think trying to use devaluation as a strategy to boost economic growth would not work very well. And of course, it also comes at a time when much of the world economy is quite weak. Certainly here in the US, we are seeing signs of remarkable persistent strength, but much of the rest of the world, including many of China's important export markets, Europe, Japan, and so on, are not doing well right now. So I don't think devaluation is going to help very much. It could set off a capital outflow currency depreciation spiral that becomes even harder to control. So I don't think we're going to see that.
What led to this crisis of confidence in the first place? Because there was a lot of optimism, wasn't there, associated with the post-pandemic rebound, and then it just failed to transpire. How do we get here in the first place in terms of the China malaise, if you can call it that? And is deflation now going to be the new normal?
Certainly, coming out of the COVID pandemic, it looked like China might be able to restore some growth momentum. But I think the way the latter part of the handling of the COVID pandemic went did not inspire confidence. And then in 2022 and 2023, we had the government taking some measures to cut private enterprises that were seen as being very economically successful and perhaps even becoming politically somewhat powerful, being cut down to size, especially firms in the tech sector, but also in other firms like healthcare, education, and so on. And that, I think, sent a chilling signal to businesses, private businesses across the board, that the environment might not be quite as conducive for them anymore. And if you want the private sector to innovate, create jobs, and so on, you need to do two things. You need to make sure that they have the confidence that government policies are going to support them. And second, you also need the financial markets delivering credit and other forms of financial support to small and medium enterprises. And in both of these dimensions, things are not working very well. So that, I think, has been a real setback in terms of the point you raised about why confidence has been so weak.